These 5 largemouth bass lures are guaranteed to catch more bass all year round from the shore. You're not going to want to miss this. My name is Wesley Littlefield with YourBassGuy.com, and I personally use these 5 lures from the bank just about every time I go out because they're very simple to use and they simply work and they catch big largemouth. So if that's what you want to know, let's get to it. One of the biggest struggles for new anglers and even seasoned anglers like myself is knowing which lures to throw and when to throw them. And I found that these 5 they work just about anywhere, anytime. And number 1 is a spinnerbait. Now, what exactly is a spinnerbait? They've usually got blades on them. They're different shaped blades for different scenarios. For the most part, remember that a more rounded blade like this is going to give off more vibration than a long skinny blade. And so a long skinny blade you're going to want in clear water, while the more vibration in dirty water. They usually have a weight here. They're come in all kinds of different sizes, colors, so you have to kind of choose which one you want. I usually shoot for the middle starting off. You know, when I'm first buying something, I don't want the biggest one and I don't want the smallest one, and usually the middle you can manipulate it enough to cover most scenarios. It might not be the best in the specific scenarios, but it will work a lot better than if you had a giant spinnerbait and you really needed a small spinnerbait. A medium size would work a lot better. Most spinnerbaits have a hook, just one single hook. You'll see guys add a trailer hook on there, especially in cold water, and usually that's like in the early spring when fish are just kind of swiping at it and not getting it real well. They'll add a trailer hook to increase your hookup ratio, which is simply just saying you get more and better bites. As I mentioned, they come in all kinds of different colors, from the blade colors to the skirt colors. It's kind of gonna depend on water clarity and what colors you go with. Generally, like a white and chartreuse is good in a lot of places. It's a pretty general color that works really well, even in clear water or murky water. That's generally why I typically choose this color. But like I said, there's all kinds of different colors, and you kind of have to experiment which one's gonna work for the day. Now, you might be wondering where to fish a spinnerbait. Spinnerbaits are great pretty much anywhere except like really thick grass and maybe like a lily pads. But I've thrown spinnerbaits up into laydowns, up along laydowns. Generally, like with the thick grass, it just globs up on these blades and it just doesn't work right, it doesn't look right, and you're just reeling in grass instead of actually fishing it. So I would stay away from grass, but along the edge of grass lines and stuff is good. I know, like in my pond, I can sit in the corner and cast down the bank along the edge of the grass and just hammer bass with a spinnerbait. So I highly recommend that. I also try to, if I'm fishing it a little bit deeper or like along deeper ledge, I'll even let it sink all the way to the bottom and try to run it along the bottom and hitting stuff and everything. So it's kind of a brushy bottom or even a rocky bottom at times. So that's another place you can fish it. And now let's go and move on to when to fish it. I already mentioned earlier that you can fish spinnerbaits early spring. The best time to fish a spinnerbait is usually in cloudy weather with a little bit of ripple on the water at least. If it's like bright sunny out and slick calm, a spinnerbait, for some reason, bass don't like it. And you might get 1 or 2 bites every now and then, but it's probably not gonna be the best lure for slick, calm, sunny, clear conditions. But when it's got a little bit of cloudy, partly overcast, and there's a little bit of ripple on the water, spinnerbait can be killer for largemouth bass. Lastly, we're gonna talk about how to fish it. I love a spinnerbait because it's pretty simple. You're gonna cast it out there and you're just gonna reel it back in. Sometimes you might need to vary your speed. Sometimes you might need to cast it out there, let it sink all the way to the bottom and reel it off to the bottom. But generally speaking, cast it out there. I usually let it sink to the bottom and then reel it up at just a steady, constant speed and try to bump it off of things like rocks, logs and stuff. And usually those bumps are what generate my bites. Sometimes you do have to reel it, stop it, and just let it fall back down and then pop it and reel it again. And that's will cause bites. So there's a million different ways you can fish it, but generally speaking, I mean, you can just cast it out there and bring it back at a steady retrieve and you're gonna get bites. Now that we've talked about the spinnerbait a little bit, let's move on to another one of my favorite lures. Like I said, all of these are my top 5 favorite, but the crankbait. Crankbaits come in all kinds of different shapes, different sizes, different styles, colors, you name it. Generally speaking, when I'm talking about a crankbait, it's a hard body. Sometimes it's got a bill or a lip, and some are lipless. They have treble hooks on them, generally 2 treble hooks. Sometimes they're jointed like this one, and sometimes they're not jointed like this one. You can even see that the bills are shaped differently at times. I mean, crankbaits come in a huge variety, and that's because you can fish them in a lot of different situations. So let's talk about when to fish them and where to fish them. When to fish crankbait, when the fish are actively feeding. Now, how do you know this? Part of it is you've just got to get out and fish and figure it out. And part of it is you can kind of take your clues from nature. You can look around, and generally, like if birds of prey are feeding, like you see blue herons, you see seagulls, stuff like that actively feeding in the area, then more than likely those fish are going to be actively feeding too. That's just a general rule of thumb to pay attention to that I learned from Chad Hoover, so thank you, Chad. But back to crankbaits. When to fish them? Like I said, I've never found a bad time to fish them unless that fish just simply aren't active. I've caught so many big fish with a crankbait at various times of day and different conditions, different locations. A crankbait works a lot of the time. And that's usually because it kind of mimics an injured fish, and it's just something that, hey, it's an easy meal, they've got to have it and go get it. I would say there are some bad locations to fish a crankbait, and number one would be really brushy areas. That's because you're going to end up getting treble hook caught on something, get hung up, and then you're not getting your crankbait back. I actually lost one of my favorite crankbaits because I was fishing a grassy, reedy area, and I cast, reeled down, and it got stuck on the bottom, and it was like 5 foot deep. The water was ice cold, so I wasn't getting in, and I just had to break off and go buy another one like it. But that was literally my favorite crankbait, and it was the only one I had at the time, so it sucked for the rest of the day, but learn from my mistakes. Grassy areas and brushy areas are not the place for a crankbait. Now with that said, fishing along grass edges and fishing along brush piles, like just over the top of a brush pile if it's deep enough, or coming out to the side of a brush pile, that is a completely different story. Crankbaits are excellent for that. One of the best places that a crankbait shine though is along rocky riprap areas. And that's because you can run them along and they hit rocks, they bounce, and they don't get hung up very easy in the rocks, and it just drives the fish nuts, and they come, and largemouth bass inhale a crankbait. Lastly, how to fish a crankbait. Once again, kind of simple. I like to keep things simple. Crankbait, you want to maintain contact with the bottom. That's the general rule with the crankbait. So if you can slow roll it and maintain contact with the bottom, do that. If you can speed it up, then do that. I generally want to fish a crankbait as fast as the fish will allow me. So if I have to just sit there and slow roll it, I might end up switching to something more like a spinnerbait or a jig or something different. But if I can burn that crankbait, and you can burn it a lot more than you think, because you're not going to outrun the fish, I promise. But if you can burn it, that's generally the best, because it guarantees you're hitting stuff and getting the fish's attention. The next one that we're going to talk about is the jig. Now, when I'm talking about the jig, I'm using a very general term, because we can have more of a swim jig, we can have like a football head jig, we can have a finesse jig, we can be talking about a bladed jig like this one, chatterbait if you want to call it that. There are so many jigs out there, and they all get big bites. I actually recently caught one of the biggest fish of my life on a chatterbait, and so I'm a firm believer in the jig bite. Now, what is a jig exactly? It's really pretty simple. It's got a skirt, kind of like you would have on a spinnerbait, but it's got a big lead or tungsten head at the top of the hook, and then it's usually got a single hook here. The bladed jig has this blade at the top, or vibrating jig, that it vibrates, it moves back and forth as you reel it back in, and it just has a little bit more intrigue, vibration. It causes a little more commotion than a regular swim jig would. So if they're being a little more aggressive, I'll go with a bladed jig versus just a swim jig. But those are the kind of differences in the jigs. A finesse jig is much smaller. It doesn't have as much of the profile. You know, you're gonna fish them all a little bit differently. And then again, all of them can overlap and be used in similar situations. So when to fish a jig, when the bite slows way down is one of the best times to fish a jig, because you can cast it out there and let it set down on the bottom and just work it back slowly to you, and it'll drive those fish nuts. The conditions will vary depending on what color you kind of need and everything, but generally speaking, you don't need anything crazy. I kind of go by the same rule that I do with my spinnerbaits. I go for like the middle sized weights, the middle sized jigs, just that way I can cover a little bit on either side of it instead of being stuck with just the one giant jig that is really only good for deep water and I'm trying to fish in shallow water, or having just a little bitty light jig that doesn't get down deep enough when I need to fish it 10 foot. So I generally stick with, once again, like the crankbaits or the spinnerbaits, and go for a medium-sized jig. But fishing a jig is for any weather condition, really. I can't think of a bad, quote-unquote, bad time to fish a jig, because during the spawn, you're gonna get fish on jig bites. During the winter, you're gonna slow way down and catch fish on jigs. During the heat of the summer, you can go a little deeper, catch fish on jigs. During the fall, you can burn a swim bait or chatterbait and catch fish on jigs. As far as the jig goes, there's no bad time to throw it. And even better, there's really no bad place to throw a jig, because it can handle thick laydowns, it can handle deep brush piles, it can handle rock, it can handle grass. It's super versatile, and I think that's why it just lands so many bites and so many big bites, because it can get places that other lures simply cannot get. So how to fish a jig, that's honestly going to depend on what kind of jig you're using. Now, a swim jig, you're going to swim it back, so you're going to cast it out and reel it back. You might give a few twitches, something like that, and just to get the fish's attention or whatever they're kind of wanting for the day. Play around with the retrieve on a swim jig, but generally speaking, you're just going to cast it out and reel it back. The same goes with chatterbait or a bladed jig. You're going to cast it out, you're going to reel it back, you're going to let it sink, or you can even drag a bladed jig along the bottom, and you can do that with a swim jig. But the best jig for dragging it on the bottom is probably a football head jig. And then also there's the finesse jig that you're going to cast out there and you're just going to let it sit, and then you're going to twitch it a little bit, and then you're going to let it sit, and then you're going to twitch it back up a little bit and reel up the slack, and then you're going to let it sit. So there's endless possibilities on even how to fish a jig, and once again, because it's versatile, I think that's why so many people love using a jig, myself included. Another very versatile bait, and that's because there's so many variations of it, is soft plastics. We're talking soft plastic worms, soft plastic lizards, soft plastic frogs, whatever it is, soft plastics work, and you can rig them up a bunch of different ways. That we've actually got several videos showing how to rig worms, several different rigs that you can use. So I'll leave the links in the description below and you guys can check those out. But soft plastics catch a lot of fish, and I've caught big fish using soft plastic. Now, we call them soft plastics because they're kind of a rubbery, soft feeling made from a plastic rubber kind of material. They come in all kinds of different colors. You can see this one's got like a chartreuse tail with like the green pumpkin, colored black flakes. There's all kinds of different colors that you can get. I've got like a black lizard or salamander, whatever you want to call it. I've got some black with red flake, curly tail worms. There's curly tail grubs. There's flukes, which are just like, look like little bait fish. I mean, there's all kinds of soft plastics that you can use, and they simply just get bites, lots of bites from largemouth. I generally start fishing soft plastics when I stop getting bites with either my spinnerbaits and my crankbaits. I generally switch over to a soft plastic, and the reason is because you've got to slow down when fishing them. Now, some variations, you can fish them a little faster, like a Texas rig or a Carolina rig. You can fish a little bit faster, but generally speaking, you're gonna wanna cast it out there and retrieve it much slower than you would like with a spinnerbait or a crankbait or a bladed jig. So that's usually when I go to fish them, is after most of my moving baits stop getting bit, or I start off not getting bit by them. I'll make a quick switch and go to my soft plastics. There's not a bad time of year to use them, even though they might look like a worm or something else. fish are going to take advantage of this small, easy meal. So during the winter time, you can fish them. During the springtime, especially when all the critters are starting to come out and the water's starting to warm up, that's when the bite gets really hot with soft plastics. Deep in the water with like a Carolina rig or a weighted wacky rig, like a drop shot wacky rig, that's gonna work great with soft plastics in the summer. And during the fall, you can really move like a lizard. A big worm actually works really well in the summertime for big largemouth. But even smaller or big worms work great in the fall as well. Now, how to fish soft plastics, it's all gonna depend on what rig you're actually using. So if you're using like a Texas rig, that's usually you're gonna cast it out there, let it sink to the bottom and reel it back nice and slow, filling the bottom with your weight. The same thing goes for a Carolina rig. They're very similar, but they're gonna be very similar in the retrieve as well. A drop shot, you're gonna cast it out there and you're just gonna let it sit and you're gonna wiggle it and just make it bounce and wiggle. Or you can even kind of slowly bring it back, but most of the time you're gonna cast it out there and just let it sit. I do a lot of weightless wacky rig fishing. That's usually in like 4 foot or less of water, maybe 8 at the tops, but literally you just cast it out there and let it sink all the way to the bottom, pick it back up and let it sink all the way to the bottom, pop it back up and let it sink all the way to the bottom as you're just slowly bringing it back to the boat or the shore, whatever you're fishing from. The Nico rig and chicken rig, there's all kinds of other rigs that you can use, but generally speaking, soft plastics are for slowing down a little bit, so don't just cast it out there and start reeling it back in like you would with a crankbait or a spinnerbait. Lastly, I saved one of the most fun bites. I think for me personally, it is the most fun bite to have, and that is a topwater bite. Now, whether you're fishing a popper like this or a frog on a topwater, or you've got a whopper plopper out there bringing it in, a buzz bait. There are so many different kinds of topwaters, and they're awesome to get a bite on, especially a big largemouth bite, because you just see the explosion, water goes flying, sometimes the bait goes flying. It's just an awesome time to get a bite on a topwater. Now, once again, there's all kinds of different topwaters, from like this popper, which is a hard plastic. It's got treble hooks. You fish it very differently than you would like this weedless frog. It's a hollow body frog. It's got a soft body with just 2 hooks, and it's got a pointed nose instead of a popper nose. A concave nose, I believe that's the word. But they do make frogs that have the concave nose too, a popping frog. There's a huge variety of topwaters. I'm not going to go through them all. When to use a topwater: the water needs to be a little bit of ripples or fairly calm, and you don't want like a blaring sun coming down. So like during the middle of the day with very few clouds, you're not going to want to use topwater. Now, early morning topwaters can work really great even if you don't have a cloud in the sky. And later in the evening, I tend to go back to a topwater, especially when I'm fishing like a frog in the summertime. I just absolutely love catching stuff on topwater. Now, the time of year, I usually only throw a topwater late spring through summer and into early fall. And that's because that's usually when the bass are most willing to come shallow. Now, I'm not saying you won't catch shallow bass in the winter, but just for some reason, I typically just throw in, like I said, late spring, summer, and early fall, and then transition into different stuff if it's not getting bit. So it's not an all-around year bait, but it covers most of the time when we're fishing. I mean, I don't fish all that much in the wintertime anyways, just because it's cold and it's duck season, so I'm usually duck hunting. But my point is, topwaters work most of the year. Where to fish a topwater? Now, this honestly depends on what topwater you've got. Like this frog right here, I'm gonna throw it up into laydowns. I'm gonna throw it up into lily pads, into thick grass. Anywhere that treble hooked topwater is gonna get hung up, this is where I'm gonna throw that, and it's gonna work great. You can throw it in very similar situations as you would a spook. And one pro tip, you can actually clip one of these legs or the skirt here, and it'll help it walk in place better. And for whatever reason, it's sitting there just twitching back and forth. I think it just looks like too easy of a meal for a bass. That's the pro tip. So that's where I would fish a frog, is really thick, nasty stuff. Now the popping frog, I would fish it in more places. While you could fish it like over the top of grass and over the top of brush piles, I'd fish it a little bit more in open water because it's going to cause a little bit more commotion, and you'll be less likely to get hung up with a pointed nose frog than you will a popping frog in like thick lily pads and brush piles. Now, fishing a topwater like a popper here or a whopper plopper that has treble hooks, I'm gonna stay away from grass. I'm gonna stay away from brush piles. I'm gonna mainly fish this like along the edge, or if you've got grass just below the surface of the water, then I'll fish it there. But generally speaking, I'm not gonna throw this up into laydowns. I'm not gonna fish this around lily pads because I will spend more time going to try to get my hook or breaking off and having to retie, wasting money on lures instead of fishing. So generally speaking, if it's got treble hooks, stay away from the thick, nasty stuff. Save that for the single hooks like a frog or a buzzbait, and the treble hooks can go to less vegetation. Now, I'm not recommending that you go out and buy a whole bunch of lures. I think that if you go buy a couple of each, you will cover a big enough area, just about every fishing situation, especially from the bank, that you won't need to buy very many. So go buy 2 of each, and that'll probably cost you about $100. That's generally speaking, unless you just go crazy. That covers most fishing situations, and I promise you, you'll catch more fish more consistently just using these 5 baits. You don't gotta go buy any other fancy lures and try to learn confusing techniques. These 5 baits are simple to use and they work. Now, once you've caught your first big bass, I don't want you hurting it on accident. For years, I didn't know how to properly hold a fish, and then one day I discovered that I might be holding the big fish wrong. Usually little fish, they're hard to hurt, but the big fish, you can hold them wrong and hurt them. And if you want to know how to properly hold a fish when you're taking pictures, that way you can release it back and catch it another day, check out this video down below. And don't forget that education is important, but fishing is essential.